The teacup slipped from Alara's fingers before she even understood why her hands had gone cold. It did not shatter. It rolled across the thick carpet outside the study door and came to rest against the wall, spilling a thin brown line across the pattern of golden thread. She barely noticed. Her whole body had gone still, the way a bird goes still when it senses a hawk somewhere above it, unseen but certain. Through the narrow gap where the study door had not been closed all the way, she heard her husband's voice. Julian, Duke of Yarn, a man who measured his words the way a jeweler measures gold, was speaking softly into his phone. Not the voice he used with his stewards, not the voice he used with her. A voice she had never once heard, directed at anyone, in 3 years of marriage. "Every time I kissed you," he said, "I thought of her." Alara did not breathe. She did not move. She stood in the hallway of the house that was supposed to be hers, in the marriage that was supposed to be hers, and she listened to her husband confess something to a phone call that felt like it was carving a line straight through her chest. She waited for more. She needed more. A single sentence like that could mean 100 things, and her mind, desperate and disbelieving, tried to build a version of it that did not hurt. Perhaps he was rehearsing a line for a play. Perhaps he was quoting an old letter. Perhaps. But then she heard him laugh, quiet and tired, the kind of laugh that comes only after something true has been said out loud for the first time. And she knew. Whatever those words meant, they were not a rehearsal. They were a confession. She did not open the door. She did not announce herself, though every instinct told her that a wife had every right to walk into her own husband's study. Instead, she backed away slowly, careful not to let her shoes click against the floor, careful not to let the fabric of her dress brush too loudly against the doorframe. She retreated down the long corridor of Yarn House, past the row of ancestral portraits that had watched over 3 generations of dukes and their wives, past the tall windows that let in the gray afternoon light, until she reached her own bedroom and shut the door behind her with a softness that felt, to her, like the loudest sound in the world. She sat on the edge of her bed. Her hands were shaking. She looked down at them as though they belonged to someone else, as though the woman trembling in this room could not possibly be the same woman who had walked so calmly down that hallway only minutes before, with a tea tray and a plan to ask her husband about dinner arrangements for the weekend. 3 years. 3 years of marriage, and she had never once heard him say something like that. Not to her, not about anyone. Julian was not a man who spoke of feelings. He spoke of harvests and taxes, of horses and letters from Parliament, of his father's old debts and his mother's roses that still bloomed every spring outside the East Wing. He did not speak of kissing anyone and thinking of someone else. Alara pressed her palm against her chest, as if she could hold herself together by force if she pressed hard enough. She thought of every kiss they had shared. The first one, awkward and formal, on their wedding day, in front of 100 guests who expected nothing more than duty. The quiet ones in the mornings, before he left for his meetings with the estate managers. The ones on the nights when the house was cold and she had turned to him simply because she did not want to feel alone. Had he been thinking of someone else the entire time? Had every gentle moment between them been a performance, a mask over some deeper ache she had never been permitted to see? She stood up and walked to the window. Outside, the garden stretched toward the hills, green and endless, the way they always did. Nothing about the view had changed, and yet everything about her life felt suddenly unfamiliar, as though she had been living in a house built on ground she did not understand. She thought about who her could be. Julian had never spoken of another woman. There had been no rumors, no whispered names among the staff, no letters she had ever come across that hinted at a past love. But then again, she had never looked. She had never needed to look, because she had never had a reason to doubt him. Not until this moment. A knock came at her door. She startled, her heart lurching painfully. "My lady?" It was Mrs. Bellwether, the housekeeper, an older woman with kind eyes, and a voice that always seemed to carry the calm of decades spent managing a large and complicated household. "I found your teacup broken in the hall. Are you well?" Alara turned from the window and forced her face into something resembling composure. She had learned, over the years, how to do this. How to fold her feelings into a small, private box and place a calm expression over the top of it like a lid. "I'm quite well, Mrs. Bellwether," she said. "I was startled by a noise, that's all." Please don't trouble yourself over the cup." Mrs. Bellwether studied her for a moment longer than was comfortable, the way people who have worked in a house for many years sometimes do, as though they can read the walls and the furniture and the faces of the people who live among them better than anyone else. But she said nothing more, only nodded, and closed the door softly behind her. Alara sat back down, her mind spinning. She thought of Julian downstairs in his study, still speaking on that call, still saying things she was not meant to hear. She wondered how long this had been going on. She wondered if this was the first time, or the 100th. She wondered if the marriage she believed they had built, carefully and quietly, brick by brick, over 3 years, had ever truly existed at all, or if it had only ever existed for her. She thought back to the day they married. She had been 18, her family's fortune collapsing beneath the weight of her father's poor decisions, and Julian had been 26, dutiful, distant, agreeing to the match because his own father, dying and desperate for an heir to be secured, had asked it of him. Neither of them had spoken of love then. They had spoken of practicality, of names and titles, and the survival of 2 struggling houses. She had accepted this arrangement because she had no other choice, and because, in her quiet heart, she had hoped that perhaps something warmer might grow between them over time, the way flowers sometimes grow in soil that seems too poor to support them. And something had grown. She had felt it, slowly, over the months and years. The way Julian would pull a blanket over her shoulders when she fell asleep reading by the fire. The way he remembered, without being told, that she disliked the taste of overly sweetened tea. The way his hand would find hers during long carriage rides, not out of any performance for onlookers, but simply because they were alone, and it seemed the most natural thing in the world. She had believed, foolishly perhaps, that what had grown between them was real, that it belonged to both of them equally. Now she was not so sure. The afternoon stretched long and gray. She did not go down for dinner. She sent word through her maid that she had a headache, and she remained in her room, staring at the wall, replaying the sentence over and over in her mind, until the words lost their shape entirely, and became only sound, only ache. Every time I kissed you, I thought of her. Who was she? The question circled in Alara's mind like a hawk that would not land. She thought of every woman who had ever crossed paths with Julian in the years she had known him. Distant cousins, daughters of visiting lords, women at parties who had looked at him a moment too long. None of them had ever seemed significant. None of them had ever seemed like a ghost hiding behind her husband's eyes. But perhaps that was the point. Perhaps the woman he thought of was not someone recent at all. Perhaps she belonged to a time before Alara had ever entered his life, a memory buried so deep that even Julian himself had not realized how much power it still held over him until the words slipped from his mouth on a quiet afternoon call. Night fell slowly over Yarn House. Alara heard Julian's footsteps pass her door once, pause, and then continue down the hall toward his own chambers. He did not knock. He did not ask after her health, though word of her headache had surely reached him by now. She lay in the darkness, listening to the old house settle around her, the wooden beams creaking softly, as though even the building itself carried old secrets it had never spoken aloud. She thought of confronting him. She rehearsed the words in her mind, imagining herself walking into his study and repeating back to him exactly what she had heard, watching his face for the flicker of guilt or fear that would tell her everything she needed to know. But each time she imagined the scene, something in her hesitated. She was not ready. Not yet. She needed to understand more before she allowed him to see how deeply his words had wounded her. Because that was the truth she could not escape, no matter how she tried to protect herself from it. She loved him. Somewhere between the practical arrangement and the quiet mornings and the small gestures that had, in time, become the architecture of her life, she had fallen in love with her own husband, and love, she now understood, with a clarity that felt almost cruel, was precisely what made this pain so unbearable. If she had never loved him, his words would have meant nothing. She could have shrugged them off as the private business of a man she barely knew, but she did know him, or she had believed she did, and that was the tragedy folding itself quietly around her heart in the dark. She thought of her mother, long since passed, who used to tell her that every marriage carried within it a locked room, a place where one partner kept something the other was never meant to see. Alara had always believed this was only a saying, a bit of old wisdom, meant to comfort young brides nervous about the unknown futures ahead of them. Now she wondered if her mother had known something true after all. Perhaps every house held such a room. Perhaps she had simply never expected to find the door standing open in her own home, the space behind it filled with a name she did not know, and a grief she had never been permitted to share. Sleep did not come easily. When it finally did, sometime near dawn, it came in fragments, broken by images of a woman she could not see clearly, a shape without a face, standing always just behind Julian's shoulder, in every memory Alara tried to hold on to. She woke exhausted, the gray morning light filtering weakly through her curtains, and for a moment, in the fog between sleep and waking, she almost believed the day before had been a dream. Then she saw the small stain on the carpet outside her door where the tea had spilled, faint now, but still visible, and she remembered everything at once, the weight of it settling back onto her chest like a stone. She rose, dressed slowly, and looked at herself in the mirror for a long moment before leaving her room. Her reflection looked steady, composed, every hair in place, every line of her gown perfectly arranged. It was a good disguise. She would need it, she realized, for however long it took her to understand the truth hiding inside her husband's heart. Downstairs, she found Julian at the breakfast table, reading a letter with the same calm concentration he brought to everything. He looked up when she entered, and for a brief moment, something crossed his face, something she might have called relief in another life, before it settled back into the familiar politeness that had always defined their mornings together. "Good morning," he said. "I hope your headache has passed." "It has," she said, taking her seat across from him. Her voice did not shake. She was proud of that at least. "Thank you for asking." He nodded and returned his attention to his letter, and the silence between them stretched on as it always did, comfortable to anyone watching from the outside, but no longer comfortable to Alara at all. She watched him over the rim of her teacup, studying the lines of his face, as though she might find, hidden somewhere in his expression, the shape of the woman he had spoken of the day before. She found nothing. Julian's face gave away exactly what it always gave away, which was very little. And that, Alara realized with a quiet, aching certainty, was precisely the problem. She had married a man who kept his heart behind a locked door, and only now, by accident, had she discovered that the door existed at all. She did not know yet what she would do with this discovery. She only knew that nothing about her marriage would ever feel quite the same again, and that somewhere beneath the calm surface of the life she had built with Julian, Duke of Yarn, there was a truth waiting to be uncovered, a truth that had a name, a face, and a claim on her husband's heart that she had never known to compete against. The morning passed in silence, each of them pretending, for the sake of the servants and the routine of the house, that nothing at all had changed. But Alara knew better now. Somewhere in this house, or in the world beyond it, there was a woman named only her, and Alara intended to find out exactly who she was. 3 years earlier, before the words in the study, before the broken teacup, before the long nights of doubt, there had been only a letter and a decision made in a hurry, the way important decisions in desperate families often are. Alara had been sitting in her father's study when the letter arrived, the paper thick and cream-colored, sealed with the wax crest of the House of Yarn. Her father, Viscount Whitmore, had read it twice before setting it down on the desk, with hands that trembled slightly, though whether from age or nerves, Alara could not tell. "The Duke of Yarn wishes to discuss a marriage," he had said, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of a man trying not to sound as desperate as he felt. "Between his son and you." Alara had been 18 at the time, and though she had grown up knowing her family's fortunes were fragile, she had not understood how fragile until that very year, when the debts her father had quietly accumulated over a decade of poor investments finally came due all at once. Their estate, Whitmore Hall, was in danger of being sold to cover what was owed. The servants had already begun to whisper about which of them might be let go first. Her younger brother's education, promised and planned for years, hung in uncertain balance. And then, unexpectedly, this letter. A proposal from one of the wealthiest and most respected families in the region, offering not romance, not courtship, but a practical solution: marriage, to secure both houses. A merger of fortune and name that would save Whitmore Hall from ruin and, in exchange, provide Julian, heir to the Duke of Yarn, with a wife suitable to the position his own father was determined he fill before illness took him. "You do not have to agree," her father had said, though the desperation in his eyes told a different story entirely. "I would never force you into a marriage you did not want." But Alara had understood, even at 18, that there was no true choice here at all. Not really. If she refused, her family would lose everything, and the weight of that loss would fall not only on her father, but on her mother, her brother, the servants who had cared for her since childhood, the tenants who depended on the estate for their livelihoods. If she agreed, everyone would be saved, and she would simply have to learn to live a life that was not the one she had once imagined for herself, full of quiet love and slow discovered affection. "I will meet him," she had said, "before I decide anything." The meeting had taken place in a formal parlor at Yarn House, arranged with all the stiffness of a diplomatic negotiation rather than a courtship. Julian had arrived precisely on time, dressed in dark, well-tailored clothes that spoke of quiet wealth rather than showy excess. He was 26 then, tall, with a serious face that rarely shifted from its careful neutrality, and eyes that seemed, even in that first meeting, to be looking somewhere just beyond the room they stood in. "Lady Alara," he had said, bowing slightly, "thank you for agreeing to this meeting." "Thank you for proposing it," she had replied, matching his formality precisely, though her heart had been pounding beneath her composed exterior. They had spoken for perhaps an hour that first day, mostly about practical matters, the management of estates, the expectations of their families, what their lives together might look like, structured around duty and mutual respect rather than romance. Julian had been honest with her, in a way she had not expected. "I will not pretend this is a love match," he had said, his voice steady, but not unkind. "My father is dying, and he wishes to see the yarn line secured before he passes. I am agreeing to this marriage because it is my duty, and because, from everything I have heard of your family, I believe you would make a fair and capable duchess. I hope, in time, we might build something between us that resembles friendship, if nothing more." Alara had appreciated his honesty, even as it settled something cold and quiet in her chest. She had not expected declarations of love, not from a stranger arranged into marriage by desperate circumstance, but hearing the practical truth spoken so plainly had still carried its own particular ache. "I understand," she had said, "and I would hope for the same. Friendship, at the very least, seems a reasonable foundation to build upon." The wedding had taken place 3 months later, in the grand chapel at Yarn House, attended by both families and a gathering of nobility, who had come more out of curiosity than genuine celebration. Alara remembered the day mostly in fragments, the weight of the gown her mother had chosen for her, the cold press of Julian's hand in hers, as they exchanged vows neither of them fully believed yet, the kiss at the end of the ceremony, brief and formal, performed for the sake of tradition, rather than any depth of feeling. She remembered thinking, as she stood beside her new husband and looked out at the crowd of well-wishers, that she had just signed away the life she once imagined for herself, the one where she might fall in love slowly, naturally, with a man who chose her not out of duty, but out of genuine desire. In its place, she had accepted a life of practicality, of managing a household and fulfilling obligations, of building something that might, with patience, resemble contentment, even if it never quite reached the height of true happiness. The early months of the marriage had been quiet and careful. Julian was a considerate husband in the ways that mattered most for daily life. He ensured she had everything she needed, that her family's debts were settled promptly and discreetly, that her transition into the role of duchess was made as smooth as such a transition could be made. But he remained emotionally distant, speaking mostly of practical matters, retreating often into his study for long hours of work that Alara did not fully understand and was rarely invited to share. She had told herself, during those early months, that this was simply how their marriage would be: respectful, practical, perhaps even, in time, comfortable. She had not expected anything more, and so she had not allowed herself to be disappointed by anything less. But slowly, almost without her noticing, something had begun to shift. It started small. Julian remembering, without being asked, that she preferred her morning tea without sugar. Julian arranging for her favorite flowers to be planted in the garden, after overhearing her mention them once in passing to a servant. Julian sitting with her by the fire on cold evenings, not speaking much, but present in a way that felt increasingly less like obligation and more like genuine desire for her company. She remembered the first time he had truly made her laugh, 6 months into their marriage, during a dinner where he had recounted, with surprising dry humor, an encounter with a particularly stubborn tenant farmer who had refused to accept new irrigation methods, no matter how many times they were explained to him. She remembered the surprise on Julian's own face when her laughter had rung out across the dining room, as though he too had not expected such warmth to exist between them. From that evening onward, something had changed in the rhythm of their days. Julian began seeking her out more often, not out of duty, but seemingly out of genuine interest in her thoughts and opinions. He asked her views on estate matters that he had previously handled entirely alone. He began sharing small stories from his own childhood, fragments of memory about his mother, who had passed when he was young, and his father, whose approval he had spent his whole life trying to earn. Alara, in turn, found herself opening to him, in ways she had not expected. She told him about her own childhood fears, her hopes for her younger brother's future, the small dreams she had once held before circumstance rearranged her entire life. Slowly, patiently, they built something together that neither of them had anticipated when they first agreed to this practical arrangement. Not quite love, perhaps, not in the grand and dramatic sense told in stories, but something warm and genuine, something that felt, to Alara at least, like the beginning of real affection. By the end of their first year of marriage, Julian had begun kissing her, not out of ceremonial obligation, but with something that felt, to her, like genuine tenderness. Quiet kisses in the mornings before he left for meetings, longer kisses on evenings when the house was still and they had no reason to hurry apart. She had allowed herself, slowly and carefully, to believe that whatever this was between them, it was real, and it belonged entirely to the two of them. She thought of all of this now, sitting once again in her bedroom the morning after overhearing Julian's confession, and she felt the foundation of those memories crack slightly beneath the weight of new doubt. Had any of it been real? Had his tenderness always carried, somewhere beneath its surface, the shadow of another woman he could not forget? She remembered, too, small moments she had once dismissed without much thought, the way Julian sometimes grew quiet and distant on certain days each year, offering no explanation beyond a vague mention of business matters requiring his attention. The locked drawer in his study desk that she had never questioned, assuming it held nothing more than private financial documents. The portrait that had once hung in the East Wing gallery, removed years before her arrival, which she had been told depicted a distant cousin who had passed away young. At the time, none of these details had seemed significant. They had simply been part of the strange, quiet mysteries that exist within every old house. Threads of history, too tangled and too distant to bother unraveling. Now, each one felt like a piece of evidence she had overlooked, a clue pointing toward a truth she had never thought to search for. She rose from her chair and walked slowly toward her window, looking out over the same gardens she had admired the day before, the same green hills stretching endlessly toward the horizon. Nothing about the view had changed, and yet she felt, standing there, as though she were looking at an entirely different world than the one she had believed herself to be living in only 2 days before. She thought of the vow she had made without truly understanding its weight, to love, honor, and remain faithful to Julian, Duke of Yarn, for as long as they both lived. She had made that vow expecting, at best, mutual respect and growing affection. She had not expected to fall as deeply in love as she now realized she had, and she certainly had not expected to discover, so suddenly and so painfully, that her husband's heart might still be tethered to someone else entirely. She resolved, standing there in the quiet morning light, that she would not simply accept this uncertainty. She would find out who this woman was. She would understand, fully and completely, what shadow it was that had followed her husband into their marriage bed, into every kiss they had ever shared, into the quiet architecture of the life they had built together over 3 careful years. Whatever the truth turned out to be, she needed to know it, because a marriage built on a secret this large could not continue to stand much longer without either crumbling entirely or finding some way to be rebuilt on more honest ground. And so, with a steadiness she did not entirely feel, Alara began to plan. It began with the perfume. Alara noticed it 3 days after the overheard conversation, during a visit from Julian's aunt, Lady Ophelia, who had come to discuss preparations for the upcoming harvest festival that Yarn House hosted every autumn. Lady Ophelia wore a particular scent, something floral and slightly sweet, a fragrance Alara had smelled on her before without paying it much attention. But this time, she watched Julian's reaction as his aunt entered the parlor, and what she saw made her breath catch. His face, usually so composed, flickered for just a moment, a brief tightening around his eyes, a stiffening of his shoulders, before he smoothed his expression back into practiced calm and greeted his aunt warmly. It was subtle. Anyone not looking closely would have missed it entirely. But Alara had spent 3 years learning the small signals of her husband's face, the tiny shifts that betrayed whatever he was trying to keep hidden, and she recognized this one immediately as discomfort, quick and involuntary, gone before most people would even register it had appeared. She said nothing during the visit, but afterward, once Lady Ophelia had departed and Julian had retreated to his study, Alara found herself standing in the hallway outside her own bedroom, thinking carefully about the scent that had caused such a reaction. She did not know its name, but she recognized the type of flower woven through it: jasmine, mixed with something warmer, perhaps sandalwood. A distinct combination, not one she had smelled on many other women in their social circle. She filed the observation away carefully, the way one might file away a puzzle piece before understanding what the full picture would eventually become. The following week, she noticed something else. She had gone looking for a particular ledger in Julian's study, one he had asked her to review regarding expenses for the Eastern farms, and while searching through his desk drawers for the correct folder, she came across one drawer that would not open. It was locked, its small brass keyhole catching the afternoon light streaming through the study window. She had seen this drawer many times before, of course. It had always been locked, for as long as she had lived in this house, and she had simply assumed, without much thought, that it contained private financial papers, or perhaps documents related to his father's old debts, things not meant for casual eyes. She had never questioned it, because she had never had reason to. Now, standing before it, she felt a different kind of curiosity stirring in her chest, sharper and more urgent than mere idle wondering. She tried the handle once more, gently, though she knew it would not budge, and then she stepped back, considering. She did not have the key. She did not know where Julian kept it, or if he even carried it with him at all times, or if perhaps it rested somewhere in this very room, hidden in plain sight the way important secrets so often were. She scanned the shelves, the small decorative boxes arranged along the mantelpiece, the drawers of the side table near the window, searching for anything that might resemble a small brass key. She found nothing that afternoon, but she noted, with growing certainty, that whatever lay behind that locked drawer was connected somehow to the mystery she was determined to solve. That evening, over a quiet dinner, she asked Julian, carefully and casually, about the East Wing Gallery. "I was thinking," she said, keeping her voice light, "that the East Wing could use a bit of refreshing. The light in that corridor is lovely in the mornings, and yet it feels rather bare. Perhaps we might hang some new portraits there." Julian's fork paused halfway to his mouth, just for a moment, before he set it down and reached for his glass of wine instead. "The East Wing has always been somewhat bare," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "I've never given it much thought." "I noticed empty spaces on the walls," Alara continued, watching him closely, as though portraits had once hung there and were removed. "Do you know anything about that?" A long pause followed, longer than felt natural for such a simple question. Julian's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and for a moment, Alara thought he might refuse to answer at all. "There were a few old family portraits," he said finally, his tone measured and distant. "Distant relatives, mostly. My father had them removed years before you and I married." He felt the gallery had grown cluttered. It was a plausible explanation. It was also, Alara felt certain, not entirely true. There had been something in his voice, some careful control, that suggested he was choosing his words with great precision, avoiding a fuller truth that lay just beneath the surface of what he was willing to share. She did not push further that evening. She had learned, over the years, that pressing Julian, when he had decided to close a subject, rarely yielded anything, except a longer, more determined silence. Instead, she let the conversation move on to other matters: the harvest festival preparations, A letter that had arrived from her brother describing his progress at university. Small and comfortable topics that allowed the tension in the room to ease. But later that night, unable to sleep, Elara found herself once again turning the pieces over in her mind. The perfume that unsettled him, the locked drawer he had never explained, the portraits removed before her arrival, their absence covered by a story that did not quite ring true. She decided, lying awake in the darkness, that she needed help. She could not continue searching alone, piecing together fragments without any clear direction, hoping that eventually the picture would become clear on its own. She needed someone who had known this house, and this family, longer than she had. Someone who might remember things Julian himself was unwilling to share. The following morning, she sought out Mrs. Bellwether. She found the housekeeper in the small sitting room adjacent to the kitchens, where Mrs. Bellwether often reviewed the household accounts in the quiet hours, before the rest of the staff began their daily tasks. Elara knocked softly on the open door, and Mrs. Bellwether looked up, her expression warming immediately at the sight of her mistress. "My lady," she said, rising slightly from her chair. "Is something needed?" "Please sit," Elara said, entering the room and closing the door gently behind her. "I wanted to speak with you about something. If you have a moment." Mrs. Bellwether's expression shifted subtly, curiosity replacing simple courtesy. She gestured to the chair across from her own, and Elara sat, folding her hands carefully in her lap as she considered how best to begin. "You've worked at Yarn House for many years," Elara said. "Longer than I have lived here, certainly. Longer, I believe, than even my husband has been Duke." "I came into service here as a young girl," Mrs. Bellwether said, her voice carrying the warmth of old memory. "I have seen 3 generations of this family grow, and I hope to see a 4th, if I am fortunate enough to remain in good health." Elara nodded, appreciating the woman's steady presence, the kind of quiet loyalty that came only from decades of shared history within a single household. "I wanted to ask you," Elara continued carefully, "about the portraits that used to hang in the East Wing gallery. Julian tells me they were removed because his father felt the space had grown cluttered. But I confess, something about that explanation feels incomplete." Mrs. Bellwether's expression grew guarded, the warmth in her eyes cooling slightly into something more cautious. She glanced toward the closed door, as though checking that no one else might overhear this conversation, before she spoke again. "My lady," she said slowly, "there are some matters within this family that are not mine to discuss. Not out of any disrespect toward you, but out of loyalty to a household I have served faithfully for a very long time." "I understand your loyalty," Elara said gently. "And I would never ask you to betray it lightly. But I believe something is happening within my own marriage that I do not fully understand. Something that may be connected to whatever those portraits once depicted. I am not asking you to share family secrets simply out of curiosity. I am asking because I believe my own happiness, and perhaps my husband's as well, depends on understanding a truth that has been buried for a very long time." Mrs. Bellwether studied her for a long moment, her weathered face carrying the weight of careful consideration. Finally, she sighed, a long and heavy sound that seemed to carry years of unspoken burden within it. "There was a woman," she said quietly, "many years ago, before you ever came to this house. Her name was Vivian. She and the young Duke, your husband, were very much attached to one another, before circumstances forced them apart." Elara felt her heart begin to pound, the pieces she had been gathering suddenly aligning into a shape she had feared, but not yet fully allowed herself to imagine. "What happened to her?" Elara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Bellwether glanced toward the door once more before answering, her voice dropping lower still, as though even now, years later, the subject remained too delicate to speak of freely within these walls. "She left," Mrs. Bellwether said, "many years ago now. It was not her choice, not entirely. And I believe, my lady, that some wounds from that time have never fully healed, not for her, and perhaps not for your husband either." The room fell silent, except for the distant sound of servants moving through the corridors beyond, the ordinary rhythms of the household continuing on, unaware of the quiet revelation taking shape within these 4 walls. Elara sat still, absorbing the weight of the name she had just learned, a name that had haunted the edges of her marriage, without her ever knowing it existed. "Vivian." She repeated it silently to herself, testing its shape, wondering how many times Julian had thought this name in the quiet hours of his own private grief, hidden so carefully behind the composed face he presented to the world, and to her, every single day of their marriage. "Tell me everything you know," Elara said, leaning forward slightly, her earlier caution giving way now to an urgent need for answers. "Please, Mrs. Bellwether, I promise you, whatever you share with me will remain between us, unless I find reason to bring it before Julian himself." Mrs. Bellwether hesitated a moment longer, her fingers twisting together in her lap, before she finally nodded, as though she had decided that the truth, however painful, deserved to be spoken after so many years of careful silence. "Vivienne Ashworth," she began. "Her family lived on a neighboring estate, smaller than Yarn House, but respectable enough. She and your husband grew up together, in a manner of speaking. Their families were friendly, and the two of them were often thrown together at gatherings from the time they were quite young. By the time they were young adults, it was clear to anyone who spent time in their company that they cared for one another a great deal." "How old was Julian?" Elara asked. "He was 22 when it ended," Mrs. Bellwether said. "Vivienne was a year younger. They had spoken, I believe, of marriage between themselves, though nothing formal had yet been arranged. The old Duke, Julian's father, had other plans for his son." "What plans?" Mrs. Bellwether's expression grew troubled. "The Ashworth family, though respectable, did not carry the fortune or connections the old Duke believed necessary for securing the future of this house. He had, even then, begun to feel the weight of debts accumulating from poor investments made earlier in his life, debts he kept largely hidden from public knowledge. He believed Julian's marriage needed to serve the estate's interests above all else, and Vivienne, however beloved, could not offer what the family required." Elara felt a strange, unwelcome kinship stirring within her at these words, a recognition of circumstances that echoed her own arranged marriage far too closely for comfort. "What happened between them?" she asked. "The old Duke forbade the match," Mrs. Bellwether said. "He informed Julian, in no uncertain terms, that if he pursued marriage with Miss Ashworth against his father's wishes, he would be disinherited entirely, and the family fortune would pass instead to a distant cousin, with little regard for the tenants and staff, who depended upon this estate for their livelihoods. And Julian chose duty over love," Elara said quietly, understanding now the shape of the sacrifice her husband had made, long before she had ever entered his life. "He did," Mrs. Bellwether confirmed, "though I do not believe the choice came easily to him. I remember him during those months, my lady. He was not the composed young man you know today. He was troubled, restless, prone to long silences that worried even his own father, though the old Duke never once wavered in his demand. Her family, humiliated by the rejection and the manner in which it became known throughout the county, arranged for her to travel abroad, to stay with distant relatives in France, ostensibly to further her education and refine her manners, before eventually returning to seek a more suitable match elsewhere. I do not believe she ever returned to this county. The last I heard, many years ago now, she had settled somewhere on the continent, though I confess I do not know the particulars." Elara absorbed this information slowly, feeling the shape of her husband's past settle into something far more complicated than she had imagined. Not a betrayal committed against her directly, but an old wound, a grief carried silently for years, hidden beneath the composed surface he presented to everyone around him, including, perhaps especially, his own wife. "Why would he never speak of this to me?" Elara asked, more to herself than to Mrs. Bellwether, though the housekeeper answered anyway. "Perhaps he believed it would serve no purpose, except to burden you with a sorrow that belonged entirely to his own past," Mrs. Bellwether offered gently. "Or perhaps, my lady, some wounds run so deep that even years later, a person cannot find the words to speak of them, without reopening pain they have worked hard to keep buried." Elara nodded slowly, though the explanation did little to ease the ache, building steadily in her chest. She understood, perhaps, why Julian might have chosen silence, but understanding did not erase the pain of discovering, so suddenly, and so completely by accident, that her husband's heart had carried a grief this significant for the entirety of their marriage, without her ever knowing. "Thank you for telling me," Elara said finally, rising from her chair. "I know this was not easy for you to share." "My lady," Mrs. Bellwether said, also rising, her expression softening with something that resembled genuine concern. I have watched this family for many years, through joy and through sorrow alike. I have also watched you these past 3 years, and I have seen genuine happiness grow between you and the young Duke. Happiness that seemed, to my eyes at least, entirely real. Whatever shadow remains from his past, I do not believe it diminishes what has grown between the two of you since your marriage began. Alara offered a small, grateful smile, though inwardly she was not yet certain she could believe those words fully. She thanked Mrs. Bellwether once more, and left the small sitting room, walking slowly back through the quiet corridors of Yarn House, her mind turning over everything she had just learned. Vivian Ashworth, a name, finally, to attach to the shadow that had followed her marriage without her knowledge. A young love denied by a demanding father. A sacrifice made not out of coldness but out of duty. The same duty that had, in its own strange way, brought Julian and Alara together in the first place. She found herself standing, without quite intending to, outside the entrance to the East Wing Gallery, the long corridor stretching before her with its empty walls where portraits had once hung. She walked slowly down its length, imagining what those portraits might have depicted. Vivian herself, perhaps, commissioned during happier days, before circumstance tore the young couple apart, or perhaps portraits of Julian during that same period. Images the old Duke could not bear to look upon. Once his son's heartbreak became a source of household tension, he preferred to forget entirely. She reached the end of the gallery, and turned to look back the way she had come, the pale walls stretching empty and silent around her, holding within their blankness the ghost of a story she was only now beginning to understand. That evening, at dinner, she watched Julian more closely than she had in a long while, searching his familiar face for signs of the young man Mrs. Bellwether had described, the restless, troubled figure who had once loved someone so deeply that even now, years later, the memory of her could rise unbidden in the middle of a quiet phone call. She said nothing of what she had learned. She was not yet ready to confront him directly, not until she understood more fully what role, if any, Vivian still played in his present life. The overheard conversation suggested contact had been recent, perhaps even ongoing. She needed to know why, and what it meant, before she allowed herself to speak the truth of her discovery aloud. But as she watched her husband across the dinner table, discussing some minor matter of estate business with careful, measured words, she felt something shift within her own heart. Not anger, exactly, though traces of that emotion certainly lingered. Something closer to grief, a mourning for the young man who had once loved so freely before duty, forced him into a lifetime of careful restraint, and a mourning, too, for the marriage she had believed was built on solid ground, only to discover it rested instead upon a foundation with cracks she had never known to look for. She excused herself early that evening, claiming tiredness, and retreated once more to her own chambers, where she sat by the window long into the night, watching the moon rise slowly over the gardens below, and wondering what other secrets this old house still held within its quiet, watchful walls. In the days that followed, Alara found herself caught in a strange and difficult tension between two truths she could not reconcile. The first was the story Mrs. Bellwether had shared, a tale of young love denied by duty, a wound that belonged to Julian's past, long before Alara had ever entered his life. The second truth was the ache spreading through her own heart, an ache she could no longer deny or explain away as simple wounded pride. She loved him, fully, completely, in a way she had never expected to feel when she first agreed to their practical arrangement 3 years before. She realized this most clearly on a quiet afternoon, several days after her conversation with Mrs. Bellwether, while walking alone through the gardens behind Yarn House. She had gone outside seeking distraction, hoping the fresh air and the familiar paths might help settle the restless thoughts that had consumed her since overhearing Julian's confession. Instead, standing beneath the old oak tree, where she and Julian had once shared a quiet conversation about nothing of particular importance, simply enjoying each other's company on a warm summer evening, she felt the full weight of her feelings settle over her like a physical thing. She loved the way Julian's brow furrowed slightly when he concentrated on estate ledgers late into the evening. She loved the rare, unguarded moments when something amused him deeply enough to draw out genuine laughter, moments that had become more frequent as their marriage progressed. She loved the quiet strength he carried, the sense of steady reliability that had, over 3 years, become something she depended upon more than she had ever realized, until this crisis forced her to examine her own heart so closely. And now, she feared, all of that love had been given to a man whose own heart remained tethered to someone else entirely. She sat down on the stone bench beneath the oak tree, gathering her skirts around her, and allowed herself, for the first time since overhearing that fateful conversation, to simply weep. Not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, the tears sliding down her face as she confronted the full shape of her own heartbreak. She had not expected to fall in love within an arranged marriage. She had entered this union prepared for practicality, for respect, for perhaps a comfortable companionship built slowly over years of shared responsibility. She had not prepared herself for the possibility that she might come to love her husband so deeply that the thought of his heart belonging, even partially, to someone else would cause this much genuine pain. She thought of Vivian Ashworth, a woman she had never met, whose face she could not picture, whose voice she had never heard, and yet who now felt like the most significant presence in her marriage besides herself and Julian. What had she been like? Kind, surely, to have won Julian's heart so completely at such a young age. Beautiful, perhaps, though Alara suspected it was more than mere beauty that had captured her husband's affection all those years ago. Whatever qualities Vivian possessed, they had been enough to leave a mark on Julian's heart that even 3 years of marriage to Alara herself had not managed to erase. She wiped her tears carefully, composing herself before anyone from the household might happen upon her in this vulnerable state, and considered, for the first time, the difficult question she had been avoiding since this entire ordeal began. What did she actually want to happen next? She could confront Julian directly, demand answers about his ongoing contact with Vivian, insist upon knowing exactly what role this woman still played in his life. But some part of her feared what those answers might reveal. If Julian confessed that he still loved Vivian, that his heart had never truly belonged to Alara despite everything they had built together, what then? Could their marriage survive such a confession? Could Alara continue living alongside a man whose heart remained elsewhere, no matter how kind or dutiful he remained toward her in every practical sense? Alternatively, she could remain silent, continue as though nothing had changed, pretend she had never overheard those words in the first place. But she knew, even as she considered this option, that she could not sustain such a pretense indefinitely. The knowledge would fester within her, poisoning every quiet moment they shared, every kiss, every gentle gesture of affection, until eventually, the resentment and doubt would become impossible to hide, whether she intended to reveal it or not. She needed a middle path, she realized. She needed to understand more fully what was actually happening before she decided how to proceed. Was Julian still in contact with Vivian? Was this a recent development, or had it been ongoing throughout their entire marriage? Did Vivian still hold romantic feelings for Julian? Or had circumstances long since moved her heart in other directions? These were questions Alara could not answer through confrontation alone, not without risking a conversation that might end their marriage before she had gathered enough understanding to know if it deserved saving in the first place. She decided, sitting there beneath the old oak tree with her tears finally dried upon her cheeks, that she would continue her careful investigation before confronting Julian directly. She would learn what she could about the nature of his recent contact with Vivian, and only once she understood the full shape of the situation would she decide how best to proceed. Over the following week, Alara found small opportunities to observe Julian more closely, watching for patterns she might have previously overlooked. She noticed that he received a particular type of correspondence occasionally, letters that arrived without any return address she could identify, which he read privately in his study before locking them away, presumably in that same drawer she had never been able to open. She noticed, too, that certain days seemed to weigh on him more heavily than others, days that fell on no particular anniversary she recognized from their own marriage, but which nonetheless left him quieter and more withdrawn than usual, retreating into his study for hours at a time, emerging only when strictly necessary for meals or estate business. She began to wonder if perhaps this ongoing connection to Vivian was not romantic in nature at all, but something more complicated. Guilt, perhaps, for the way their relationship had ended all those years before. Some unresolved matter between them that required occasional communication, even if genuine romantic feeling no longer played any role in that contact. She could not know for certain without more information, and so she continued watching, gathering small pieces of evidence, waiting for the right moment to either confront Julian directly or, if fortune allowed, discover the fuller truth on her own, before that confrontation became necessary. One evening, nearly 2 weeks after the overheard conversation that had begun this entire ordeal, Ilara found herself once again standing outside Julian's study, though this time not by accident. She had noticed him retreat there after dinner, later than usual, and something in the deliberate way he had excused himself, avoiding her eyes as he did so, told her that whatever business awaited him behind that door was connected to the mystery she had been trying to unravel. She approached quietly, careful not to announce her presence, and found, once again, that the door had not been closed entirely, leaving a narrow gap through which sound traveled easily into the hallway beyond. She heard Julian's voice, low and careful, speaking once more into his phone. "I understand your concerns," he was saying, "but I need more time. This is not a simple matter, and I will not act rashly, simply because circumstances have grown urgent." There was a pause, presumably while whoever he spoke with responded, though Ilara could hear nothing of their side of the conversation. "I know what I said," Julian continued, his voice carrying a weariness Ilara had rarely heard from him before, "and I meant it. But meaning something and acting upon it are not always the same thing, especially when so much depends upon getting this right." Another pause. Ilara held her breath, straining to understand the shape of whatever conversation was unfolding on the other side of that door. "I will contact you again once I have made further progress," Julian said finally. "Please, be patient a little longer. This matters a great deal to me, more than I think you fully understand." The call ended, and Ilara heard the soft sound of Julian setting down his phone on the desk, followed by a long, heavy sigh that carried within it a weight of exhaustion she had rarely witnessed from her composed and careful husband. She retreated quietly once more, her mind spinning with new questions, even as some of her earlier fears began to shift shape. This did not sound like the conversation of a man secretly pursuing a romantic reunion with a lost love. It sounded like something more complicated, more urgent, tangled up with obligations and progress that needed to be carefully managed. But what exactly that progress involved, and why it mattered so deeply to Julian, remained frustratingly unclear. She returned to her room that night with more questions than answers, but also, for the first time since this ordeal began, a small and cautious flicker of hope that perhaps the truth was not as simple, or as devastating, as her initial fears had suggested. Despite the small flicker of hope that had emerged from the overheard conversation, the days that followed grew increasingly strained between Ilara and Julian, though the cause of that strain remained entirely one-sided, hidden within Ilara's own guarded heart. She found herself withdrawing from him in small, almost imperceptible ways. She no longer lingered as long over breakfast conversations, finding excuses instead to retreat to her own affairs shortly after the meal concluded. She began declining the quiet evenings by the fire they had grown accustomed to sharing, claiming tiredness or correspondence that required her attention, though in truth she simply could not bear the closeness of those moments, while so much uncertainty churned within her. Julian noticed the change, of course. He was not a man easily fooled by surface pleasantries, and though Ilara worked hard to maintain an appearance of normalcy, small cracks inevitably showed through her careful composure. "Is something troubling you?" he asked one evening, nearly 3 weeks after that first overheard conversation. As they sat together in the parlor following dinner, the fire crackling softly between them, while Ilara pretended to focus intently on a piece of needlework she had barely touched all evening. "I'm quite well," she said, not looking up from her stitching. "Simply tired, I think. The preparations for the harvest festival have kept me busier than usual." Julian studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable in the flickering firelight. "You've seemed distant these past weeks," he said carefully. "If something is troubling you, Ilara, I would hope you might feel able to share it with me." The gentle concern in his voice nearly broke through her careful defenses. Some part of her wanted desperately to set down her needlework, to look him directly in the eyes, and simply ask him the question that had haunted her for weeks now. Who is she? Who is Vivian, and what does she still mean to you? But she held herself back, unwilling yet to risk the conversation that might follow such a direct confrontation. Instead, she offered a small, practiced smile and shook her head. "There is nothing troubling me beyond ordinary tiredness," she said. "But thank you for your concern." Julian's expression flickered with something that might have been disappointment, or perhaps frustration, though he said nothing further on the matter, returning instead to the book he had been reading before the conversation began. The silence that followed felt heavier than any silence they had shared before, weighted with unspoken words on both sides, though only Alara understood the full shape of what remained unsaid. This pattern continued over the following days, a careful dance of distance and forced normalcy that grew increasingly exhausting to maintain. Julian, for his part, seemed to interpret Alara's withdrawal as simple unhappiness within their marriage, a possibility that clearly troubled him, though he did not press her further on the matter, respecting whatever boundaries she seemed determined to maintain. Alara caught him, more than once, watching her with a careful, thoughtful expression, as though trying to solve a puzzle he did not yet have enough pieces to complete. She wondered, in those moments, if perhaps he suspected something had changed, though she doubted he could imagine the true cause behind her sudden distance. The strain between them grew most apparent during a dinner party they hosted, nearly a month after the initial overheard conversation, an event meant to celebrate the upcoming harvest festival and strengthen relationships with neighboring estates. Alara moved through the evening with practiced grace, greeting guests warmly, ensuring conversations flowed smoothly, performing the role of duchess with the same careful precision she had cultivated over 3 years of marriage. But when she and Julian stood together, greeting arriving guests side by side as tradition required, she felt the distance between them as sharply as any physical wound. His hand rested against the small of her back, a gesture of practiced affection meant for the benefit of watching eyes, and she felt herself stiffen slightly beneath his touch, unable to fully mask the tension that had grown between them these past weeks. Julian noticed. She saw it in the brief flicker of concern that crossed his face before he smoothed his expression back into practiced hospitality for their guests. Later that evening, once the last of their visitors had departed, and the household staff had begun clearing away the remnants of the celebration, Julian found her alone in the parlor, staring into the dying embers of the fire. "Alara," he said quietly, closing the door behind him, "I cannot continue pretending I don't notice the distance that has grown between us these past weeks. Please, tell me what has changed." She turned to face him, her heart pounding painfully in her chest. This was the moment, she realized. The moment where she could either continue this exhausting pretense indefinitely, or finally allow the truth to surface between them, regardless of what consequences might follow. But even now, standing before him with the perfect opportunity to demand answers, some deep uncertainty held her back. She was not yet ready. She needed more information first, more understanding of exactly what role Vivienne still played in his present life, before she risked a confrontation that might unravel everything they had built together. "I am simply tired, Julian," she said finally, her voice steadier than she felt inside. "The festival preparations, the demands of managing this household, they have worn on me more than I expected. Please, do not read more into my distance than genuine exhaustion." Julian studied her for a long moment, clearly unconvinced by her explanation, but unwilling, it seemed, to press further against her obvious resistance. "If that changes," he said finally, "if there is ever something you wish to share with me, I hope you know I am willing to listen, whatever it may be." Alara nodded, unable to trust her voice further, and Julian, after a moment of hesitation, turned and left the parlor, his footsteps fading down the corridor toward his own chambers. Alone once more, Alara allowed herself to sink into the nearest chair, exhaustion finally overtaking the careful composure she had maintained throughout the long evening. She thought of Julian's words, his genuine offer to listen if she ever wished to share whatever burden weighed upon her, and she wondered, not for the first time, if perhaps he deserved more honesty than she had been willing to offer these past weeks. But honesty required courage she had not yet fully found within herself. Confronting him meant risking an answer she might not be prepared to hear. As long as uncertainty remained, some fragile hope could still survive within her, however painful the waiting became. She resolved, sitting alone in the quiet parlor as the last embers of the fire burned low, that she needed to find more concrete answers soon. This careful dance of avoidance could not continue indefinitely without causing irreparable damage to whatever remained of the marriage she had worked so hard to build. She needed to understand, fully and completely, the truth behind Julian's continued contact with Vivian Ashworth, and she needed to find that understanding soon, before the distance between them grew too wide to ever fully close again. The following morning, she woke with new determination. She would search his study more thoroughly, she decided. She would find a way to access that locked drawer, or discover some other piece of evidence that might finally illuminate the truth she so desperately needed to understand. She could not continue living in this uncertain limbo much longer, caught between fear and fragile hope, unable to move forward in either direction, until she knew, without doubt, exactly what secrets her husband's heart still carried from his past. Her opportunity came sooner than she expected. Julian departed for a 2-day journey to the northern boundary of the estate, where a dispute between neighboring tenants over water rights required his personal attention to resolve. He informed Alara of his departure the evening before, explaining the situation with his usual careful precision, and though a part of her felt a small pang of guilt at the relief that flooded through her upon hearing he would be absent, she pushed the feeling aside, recognizing the opportunity this absence presented. The morning after his departure, once she was certain the household had settled into its usual rhythms, and no one would question her presence in the study, Alara made her way there with quiet determination. She had spent the previous evening searching through every drawer, every decorative box, every hidden compartment she could think of in her own chambers and the more accessible rooms of the house, searching for any key that might match the lock on Julian's desk drawer. She had found nothing conclusive, though she had discovered an old ring of keys in a forgotten box within her own wardrobe, keys that had come with the house itself, passed down through generations, some of which no longer matched any locks still in use. She brought this ring of keys with her now, hoping that perhaps one among them might still fit the drawer she had been unable to open for weeks. The study felt different in Julian's absence, quieter somehow, though the familiar scent of leather and old paper still lingered in the air. Alara approached the desk slowly, feeling a strange mixture of guilt and determination as she knelt before the locked drawer and began testing keys one by one. The 7th key she tried, an old and slightly rusted piece of iron, turned with a soft click that made her breath catch in her throat. She pulled the drawer open slowly, half expecting some dramatic revelation to spill forth immediately, though in truth, the drawer contained mostly what she had originally suspected: financial documents, old correspondence related to estate matters, a few personal letters from Julian's late mother that clearly held sentimental rather than scandalous significance. But tucked beneath these ordinary documents, she found something else: a small, worn book, its leather cover soft with age, clearly well read, and carefully preserved. She lifted it carefully, opening to the first page, and found handwriting she did not recognize, elegant and flowing, clearly belonging to a woman rather than to Julian himself. She turned the pages slowly, realizing quickly that this was not a book at all in the traditional sense, but a collection of letters, bound together, presumably by Julian himself, preserved carefully within this locked drawer, for reasons she was only beginning to understand. The letters were signed, each one, with the same name: Vivian. Alara's hands trembled slightly as she began to read, though she reminded herself, even as guilt gnawed at her conscience, that she needed this understanding, needed to know the truth these letters might reveal, regardless of how uncomfortable the discovery felt. The letters spanned several months, clearly written during the period when Julian and Vivian's relationship had been forcibly ended by his father's demands. The early letters carried the tone of desperate young love, filled with promises and hopes for a future together, despite the obstacles arrayed against them. Vivian wrote of her plans, her hopes that perhaps circumstances might change, that Julian's father might eventually relent, or that some alternative solution might present itself that would allow them to remain together despite his family's objections. But as Alara continued reading, the tone of the letters shifted gradually, hope giving way slowly to resignation, and, eventually, to a quiet, devastating grief. The final letter in the collection, dated shortly before Vivian's departure abroad, carried words that struck Alara with unexpected force. Vivian had written of her heartbreak, yes, but also of something else entirely. She had written of an inheritance, a small sum of money left to her by a distant relative, which her own family had somehow mismanaged or misappropriated during the chaos surrounding her departure. She begged Julian, in this final letter, not for romantic reconciliation, which she seemed to understand was no longer possible, but for help in ensuring this inheritance eventually reached her, wherever her travels might take her, since her own family could not be trusted to see it properly delivered. Alara sat back, absorbing this unexpected revelation. This letter suggested something far more complicated than simple heartbreak or unresolved romantic longing. It suggested a debt, a promise perhaps made, and never fully honored, tangled up with family obligations and financial matters that had nothing to do with romantic love at all. She continued searching through the drawer, finding beneath the bound letters a folder of more recent correspondence, letters that appeared to have been exchanged only within the past year, their handwriting matching the elegant script of the earlier letters, but the paper crisp and new, rather than worn with age. These recent letters, Alara realized with growing understanding, suggested that Vivienne had somehow re-established contact with Julian recently, and that the subject of their correspondence involved not romantic reconciliation, but rather this same old matter of inheritance, apparently still unresolved after all these years, complicated further by circumstances Alara did not yet fully understand. One letter in particular caught her attention, dated only a few months before her wedding to Julian. In it, Vivienne wrote with evident distress about financial hardship she had encountered abroad, explaining that the inheritance owed to her had never properly materialized, and that circumstances had grown increasingly difficult for her in recent years. She asked Julian, with what read as genuine desperation, if he might help her locate the funds that were rightfully hers, funds that her own family had apparently mismanaged so thoroughly that even years later, the matter remained unresolved. Alara felt something shift within her chest as she read these words, understanding slowly dawning that perhaps this entire mystery was not about romantic betrayal at all, but about guilt, about a promise Julian had perhaps made to himself, or to Vivienne directly, to help right a wrong that had been done to her, separate entirely from the heartbreak of their ended romance. She continued searching, and near the bottom of the folder, she found a more recent letter, dated only weeks before the conversation she had overheard that had begun this entire ordeal. In this letter, Vivienne wrote of her gratitude for Julian's continued efforts on her behalf, expressing hope that the matter might finally be resolved soon, and thanking him for his kindness, despite everything that had passed between them so many years before. Alara sat very still, holding this letter carefully in her trembling hands, feeling the shape of the truth beginning to reassemble itself into something entirely different from what she had originally feared. This did not read as the correspondence of secret lovers reunited after years apart. It read as the correspondence of two people, bound together by an old debt and an old guilt, working together to resolve a matter of genuine injustice that had nothing to do with romantic betrayal at all. But then she remembered the words she had overheard, the confession that had started this entire investigation. Every time I kissed you, I thought of her. If this ongoing contact was purely about financial matters and old guilt, why would Julian speak such words during what had clearly sounded like an emotional, private conversation? She realized, sitting there among the scattered letters, that she still did not have the full picture. There remained pieces of this puzzle she had not yet uncovered, truths that existed somewhere in the space between old heartbreak, ongoing guilt, and whatever emotional complexities still lingered within Julian's heart regarding the woman he had once loved so deeply. She carefully returned the letters to their original arrangement within the drawer, locking it once more with the key she had discovered, determined that Julian would not know she had uncovered this hidden collection until she was ready to confront him directly with what she had learned. She sat for a long while afterward in the quiet study, turning over everything she now understood and everything she still did not, feeling the shape of her marriage shifting once again beneath her feet, no longer certain whether this new understanding brought her closer to peace or further from it entirely. Julian returned from the northern boundary 2 days later than expected, the tenant dispute having proven more complicated to resolve than he had originally anticipated. Alara greeted him with careful composure when he arrived, offering the practiced warmth expected of a duchess welcoming home her husband, though beneath that composure, her mind remained consumed by everything she had discovered in his absence. She had spent the intervening days considering carefully how to proceed. She understood now that Julian's continued contact with Vivienne involved matters of inheritance and old guilt rather than simple romantic longing, but she still did not understand fully why his words, the ones she had overheard weeks before, carried such emotional weight if the matter between them was purely practical. She needed to speak with him directly now. She could not continue this careful dance of avoidance and investigation indefinitely, not when so much remained uncertain about the true nature of his feelings. She found her opportunity that evening, after dinner, when Julian retreated to his study as he often did, presumably to review whatever correspondence had accumulated during his absence. Ilara followed him this time, not lingering outside the door as she had on previous occasions, but knocking firmly, and entering when he called for her to come in. Julian looked up from his desk, surprise flickering across his face at her unexpected appearance. "Ilara," he said, setting down the letter he had been reading. "Is something needed?" She closed the door behind her carefully, her heart pounding, though her voice remained steady when she finally spoke. "I need to speak with you about something important, Julian. Something I have been carrying for many weeks now, and can no longer continue keeping to myself." Julian's expression grew serious, sensing immediately that whatever she wished to discuss carried significant weight. He gestured toward the chair across from his desk, and Ilara sat, gathering her courage before beginning. "Nearly a month ago," she said, "I was walking past this study with tea, intending to bring it to you as I sometimes do in the afternoons. Your door was not fully closed, and I overheard you speaking on your phone. I did not intend to listen, but once I heard the words you spoke, I found myself unable to move away." Julian's face grew pale, understanding dawning slowly as he realized what she was about to reveal. "What did you hear?" he asked quietly. "You said," Ilara continued, her voice trembling slightly, despite her efforts to remain composed, "that every time you kissed me, you thought of her. I did not know who her was, not then, but I have spent these past weeks trying to understand, and I believe I have found much of the truth on my own." Julian's expression shifted through several emotions in quick succession, shock giving way to something that looked almost like relief, though confusion and concern quickly followed. "Ilara," he said, "I need you to understand. I know about Vivian," she interrupted gently. "I know about the marriage your father forbade, the sacrifice you made for the sake of this family's future. I know, too, about the inheritance she was owed and never received, and I believe I understand now that your recent contact with her involves helping to resolve that old injustice." Julian stared at her, clearly startled by the depth of her knowledge. "How did you learn all of this?" "Mrs. Bellwether told me some of it," Ilara admitted. "And I confess, while you were away these past days, I searched your study and found the letters you kept locked in your desk drawer. I know this was not my place to intrude upon, and I understand if you are angry with me for the invasion of your privacy. But I could not continue living with uncertainty any longer, Julian. Not when that uncertainty felt as though it was slowly destroying everything we had built together these past 3 years." Julian was quiet for a long moment, processing everything she had revealed. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weariness that seemed to come from somewhere very deep within him. "I am not angry," he said slowly. "If anything, I feel relief that I no longer need to carry this secret alone. I should have told you about Vivian long ago, Ilara. I see now that my silence has caused you far more pain than the truth ever could have." "Then tell me now," Ilara said. "Tell me everything. What is happening between you and Vivian? What did those words truly mean, the ones I overheard that day?" Julian rose from his desk and walked slowly to the window, looking out into the darkening evening as he gathered his thoughts. "The call you overheard," he said finally, "was not with Vivian herself. It was with an old friend, a solicitor I have engaged, to help locate funds that were owed to Vivian many years ago, funds her own family mismanaged during a difficult period in her life. I have been working to resolve this matter for nearly a year now, ever since Vivian reached out to me, not out of any romantic hope, but simply because she had nowhere else to turn, and remembered that I had once promised, long ago, that I would help her if circumstances ever required it." "But the words," Ilara pressed gently. "Every time I kissed you, I thought of her. What did you mean by that, if not something romantic?" Julian turned back to face her, his expression carrying an honesty she had rarely seen from him before, raw and unguarded in a way that made her breath catch. "I meant exactly what I said, Ilara, though perhaps not in the way you feared. For a long time after Vivian and I parted, I carried guilt so heavy that it colored everything in my life, including our marriage. When we first married, and even for some time afterward, There were moments when kissing you, being close to you, would remind me suddenly of the pain I had caused Vivian by choosing duty over love. I felt as though I did not deserve happiness with you, while she suffered the consequences of my father's demands and my own inability to defy them. He paused, taking a slow breath before continuing. But somewhere along the way, Elara, that changed. I stopped thinking of her during our quiet moments together. I stopped feeling guilty for finding genuine happiness in our marriage. And when I said those words on the call, I was speaking to my solicitor about exactly that realization. I told him that for the first time in longer than I could remember, when I kissed you, I no longer thought of her at all, and that this realization had frightened me, because I had grown so accustomed to carrying that guilt that its absence felt almost unfamiliar. Elara stared at him, the full weight of his words settling slowly over her, reshaping everything she had believed these past weeks into something entirely different from what she had feared. "You were saying," she said slowly, "that you used to think of her, but you no longer do. Not that you still think of her now." "Yes," Julian said softly, moving closer to where she sat. "I should have explained this to you long ago, Elara. I should have trusted you with the full truth of my past, instead of allowing you to discover fragments of it through overheard conversations and locked drawers. I am deeply sorry for the pain my silence has caused you these past weeks." Elara felt tears rising in her eyes, though this time they carried relief rather than grief. "I have been so afraid," she admitted. "Afraid that everything we built together was somehow less real than I believed, that your heart remained elsewhere, no matter how much affection you showed me." "My heart," Julian said quietly, kneeling now before her chair and taking her hands gently in his own, "belongs entirely to you, Elara. It took me longer than it should have to understand this fully, but I understand it now, with complete certainty. Whatever guilt or grief I once carried regarding Vivian, it does not diminish what has grown between us. If anything, discovering how completely you have come to matter to me has helped me finally release the guilt I carried for so long." Elara felt the last of her carefully guarded defenses finally crumble, tears spilling freely now down her cheeks, as relief and love and lingering hurt all mingled together within her chest. "I love you," she said, the words emerging with a vulnerability she had rarely allowed herself before. "I did not expect to, not within this arrangement we entered, so practically 3 years ago. But I do, Julian, completely and without reservation." Julian's own eyes grew bright with emotion as he heard her words, and he rose slightly to press a gentle kiss against her forehead, then her cheek, before finally meeting her lips with a tenderness that felt, to both of them, like the beginning of something new being built upon the honest foundation they had finally, after so many weeks of painful uncertainty, established between them. In the days following their conversation, a new openness settled between Julian and Elara, replacing the careful distance that had grown throughout the previous weeks. Julian, true to his promise, shared with her the fuller details of his ongoing efforts to help Vivian recover the inheritance that had been mismanaged so many years before. He explained that Vivian's family, after her departure abroad, had faced their own financial difficulties, and in the confusion and desperation of those years, the inheritance meant for her had been quietly absorbed into settling other family debts, leaving Vivian without the resources she had been promised. She had built a modest life for herself on the continent, working as a governess for a wealthy family in France, but the hardship of her circumstances had eventually led her to reach out to Julian, the only person from her past she still trusted enough to ask for help. "When she first wrote to me," Julian explained one evening, as they sat together in the parlor, the fire crackling warmly beside them, in a scene that finally felt as comfortable as it once had before this entire ordeal began, "I felt an overwhelming sense of guilt. Not because I still loved her in the way I once had, but because I had promised, all those years ago, that I would always help her if she ever needed it, and I had allowed years to pass without ever checking whether that promise still held any weight." "What will happen now?" Elara asked, genuinely curious about the resolution of this matter that had, in its own strange way, brought her and Julian closer together despite the pain it had initially caused. "My solicitor has made significant progress in tracing the original inheritance," Julian said. "It appears that with proper legal action, we can recover a substantial portion of what was originally owed to her, along with additional compensation for the years of hardship she endured due to her family's mismanagement. I expect the matter to be fully resolved within the next few months." "I'm glad," Alara said, and found that she meant it genuinely. Whatever complicated feelings she had once carried toward the unknown woman who had haunted the edges of her marriage, she felt now only compassion for someone who had suffered an injustice through no fault of her own, and gratitude that Julian's efforts might finally bring some measure of peace and stability to Vivian's life. "There is something else," Julian said, his expression growing thoughtful. "Vivian has asked, in her most recent letter, whether it might be possible to visit briefly, once the legal matters are resolved, simply to offer her gratitude in person, and to properly close this chapter of both our lives. I wanted to ask you, Alara, how you would feel about such a visit, given everything that has passed between us these past weeks." Alara considered this carefully. A part of her, she recognized honestly, still felt a small flicker of unease at the thought of meeting the woman who had once held such significant claim to her husband's heart. But she also understood, watching Julian's earnest expression as he awaited her response, that this visit represented something important, a chance for genuine closure, not just for Vivian and Julian, but for the lingering uncertainty that might otherwise continue to shadow their own marriage if left unresolved. "I think," Alara said slowly, "that I would like to meet her, not out of any desire to reopen old wounds, but because I believe understanding the full shape of your past, including the people who mattered within it, will help me feel more secure in our future together. I trust you, Julian. I trust what we have built together, and I believe meeting Vivian, offering her whatever kindness we can as she finally receives the justice she has waited so long for, feels like the right way to finally close this chapter completely." Julian's expression softened with visible relief and gratitude. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for your understanding, and for your grace in handling something that could have easily torn us apart instead of bringing us closer together. We are not without our own history now," Alara said with a small, wry smile. "Weeks of overheard conversations, and locked drawers, and careful investigations. Perhaps every marriage needs a trial like this at some point, a test that reveals whether the foundation beneath it is strong enough to withstand genuine uncertainty. And ours proved strong enough," Julian said, reaching for her hand across the small distance between their chairs. "Ours proved strong enough," Alara agreed, feeling, as she said the words, a settling peace within her chest that had been absent for the entirety of the previous month. Over the following weeks, life at Yarn House gradually returned to its familiar, comfortable rhythms, though enriched now by the deeper honesty that had emerged between Julian and Alara following their difficult conversation. Julian began sharing more openly with her about matters he had previously kept private, not out of any lingering deception, but simply out of old habits of guardedness that had governed his emotional life long before Alara had ever entered it. Alara, in turn, found herself trusting him more completely than she had allowed herself to before, understanding now that whatever shadows existed within his past, they did not diminish the genuine love that had grown between them. The legal matters regarding Vivian's inheritance progressed steadily over the following months, guided by Julian's solicitor, with careful attention to detail that eventually yielded a favorable resolution. Vivian would receive not only the original inheritance owed to her, but additional compensation that would allow her to establish a more secure and independent life, free from the financial hardship that had plagued her since her departure from England so many years before. As the matter neared its conclusion, Julian received word that Vivian intended to travel to England briefly, both to finalize the legal proceedings in person and to visit Yarn House as she had requested, offering her gratitude and, perhaps, finding her own measure of closure regarding a chapter of her life that had remained painfully unresolved for far too long. Alara found herself, in the days leading up to this planned visit, feeling a complicated mixture of nervousness and genuine curiosity. She would finally meet the woman whose name had haunted the edges of her marriage, whose shadow had nearly torn apart everything she and Julian had built together. But she approached the anticipated meeting now with a settled confidence, rather than the fear that had once gripped her, secure in the knowledge that whatever history existed between Julian and Vivian, it belonged firmly to the past, while her own marriage, tested and strengthened by recent trials, belonged entirely to the present and future they continued building together. Vivian arrived at Yarn House on a mild autumn afternoon, the leaves along the drive turning gentle shades of amber and gold as her carriage made its way toward the grand entrance. Alara watched from the parlor window as the carriage came to a stop, her heart beating with a nervous energy she had not felt in weeks, though she reminded herself firmly that whatever tension remained belonged only to old history, not to any genuine threat against the life she and Julian had built together. Julian met the carriage himself, offering his hand to help Vivienne descend, a simple courtesy extended to any visiting guest, though Alara noted the careful formality in his manner, respectful but appropriately distant, the behavior of a man greeting an old acquaintance rather than a lost love. Vivienne, when Alara finally saw her clearly as she entered the parlor, appeared nothing like the imagined rival Alara had once feared in the darkest days of her uncertainty. She was a woman perhaps in her early 30s now, her face carrying the marks of hardship endured over difficult years, but her expression, when she smiled warmly at Alara, held nothing but genuine kindness and gratitude. "Duchess," Vivienne said, offering a graceful curtsy. "Thank you so much for allowing me to visit. I understand this situation carries a delicate history, and I am deeply grateful for your generosity in permitting this meeting." "Please, call me Alara," she replied, offering a genuine smile in return. "I have heard a great deal about the injustice you suffered, and I am glad that Julian has been able to help resolve it properly. You are welcome here." The three of them spent the afternoon together, the conversation initially careful and formal, but gradually easing into something more comfortable as the hours passed. Vivienne spoke of her years abroad, the modest but fulfilling life she had built as a governess, the children she had come to care for as though they were her own family, in the absence of one of her own. She spoke, too, with evident gratitude, of the relief the resolved inheritance would bring to her future, allowing her finally to establish true independence and security after years of uncertain hardship. Julian, for his part, remained warm but appropriately reserved throughout the visit, his interactions with Vivienne carrying the comfortable ease of old friendship rather than any lingering romantic tension. Alara watched them together carefully, searching, despite her newfound confidence, for any sign that old feelings might still linger beneath the surface. She found nothing but genuine, uncomplicated friendship, the kind that exists between people who once shared something significant, but have long since moved into different chapters of their lives. Before Vivienne departed later that evening, she took a moment alone with Alara, the two women standing together near the entrance hall, as Vivienne's carriage was prepared for her journey to the inn, where she would stay before returning to France the following week. "I want you to know," Vivienne said quietly, "that whatever history exists between myself and your husband, it belongs entirely to the past. I see the way he looks at you, Alara. I see the life the two of you have built together, and I recognize, with genuine happiness, that he has found something with you that circumstances never allowed the two of us to fully discover. I am glad, truly glad, that he has found such happiness, and I hope you know that my gratitude toward him is exactly that, gratitude, nothing more." Alara felt a warmth spread through her chest at these words, the last remaining traces of old uncertainty finally dissolving completely. "Thank you for saying that," she replied, "and I am glad, too, that you will finally have the security and independence you deserve, after everything you endured." The two women parted with genuine warmth, and as Vivienne's carriage disappeared down the long drive into the gathering dusk, Alara felt, for the first time since this entire ordeal began, a complete and settled peace within her heart. That evening, as she and Julian sat together in the parlor, the fire crackling warmly between them, Julian reached for her hand with a tenderness that carried none of the guilt or hidden grief that had once shadowed their marriage. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for your grace throughout all of this. I know these past months have not been easy, and I know I bear responsibility for much of the pain you endured through my own silence and old guilt. But I promise you, Alara, whatever shadows once lingered from my past, they have been fully released now. My heart belongs entirely to you, without reservation, without hidden grief, completely and freely." Alara leaned into him, resting her head against his shoulder, as the fire burned steadily beside them. "I know," she said softly. "I feel it now, more certainly than I have ever felt anything before. Whatever trials we faced these past months, I believe they have only made the foundation of our marriage stronger, built now on complete honesty, rather than careful distance." Julian pressed a gentle kiss against her hair, and they sat together in comfortable silence for a long while, watching the fire burn low, secure in the knowledge that whatever challenges the future might bring, they would face them together, honestly and completely, as true partners, rather than merely dutiful companions bound by practical arrangement. In the months that followed, the Duke and Duchess of Yarn built a marriage that grew steadily deeper and more genuine with each passing season. The harvest festival that year became a celebration not just of the estate's bounty, but of the renewed happiness that had settled over Yarn House itself, visible to anyone who spent even a brief moment observing the warm, easy affection that now flowed naturally between husband and wife. Vivienne, once her legal matters were fully resolved, returned to France with the security and independence she had long deserved, eventually building a happy and stable life of her own, occasionally exchanging warm, friendly correspondence with Julian and Alara both, a testament to the genuine reconciliation that had emerged from what once seemed like an insurmountable secret. And Alara, looking back over the difficult weeks that had tested her marriage so severely, understood finally that the overheard words that had once caused her such devastating pain had, in the end, led not to the destruction of everything she had built, but to something far more valuable. A marriage founded not on careful distance and hidden secrets, but on complete honesty, hard-won trust, and a love that had proven, through genuine trial, to be entirely real, entirely hers, and entirely worth every difficult step it had taken to finally, fully understand.